Hi everyone, thank you for joining SLR's webinar today on the rapidly growing topic of nature reporting and how to take a holistic approach to climate and nature related reporting. We're joined by two presenters today, Stuart Lenton and Sarah Kehoe. Before we get started, I'll take you through some housekeeping. So to ensure everyone can hear the presentation and to minimize any background noise, everyone will be muted, but of course we welcome any contributions and questions. So please make sure to use the question box on the screen and we can pick up some questions at the end. So now I'm going to pass you over to Stuart to start.
Thanks very much, Rachel, and good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here this afternoon to talk to you about this really important and emerging subject. So obviously what we want to try and do today is to just get across, I know many of you will already be aware of climate reporting, will be fairly well developed in your journey. Obviously nature reporting is relatively new and nascent, but there's real opportunities to think about these in a more holistic way. And obviously, if we think about these as topics in their own right, they are very heavily interrelated. So climate and nature are part of the same system. Climate is arguably part of nature. So nature is obviously all of the systems, forces, processes encompassed in all of the realms that are shown on the screen at the moment. The atmosphere is impacted by both nature and climate, and obviously nature restoration can have a positive impact on climate. Biodiversity is the variability among living organisms. And obviously biodiversity is a really important part around the resilience of ecosystems. And I'm going to talk a little bit in a moment about natural capital and ecosystem service and the importance and relevance of those to nature reporting. And obviously all of those together impact on society being people, corporates, financial institutions. All of these depend upon nature and have impacts upon nature. And so there are real opportunities here to think about this in a more holistic way. Next slide, please. So when we think about nature reporting, what we're essentially talking about is ecosystem services and our dependency on aspects of nature that provide goods and services. So the concept of natural capital is essentially this idea that nature, the physical stocks of nature, provide a range of benefits or flows, which we refer to as ecosystem services. So if you can see on the left there, we've got the physical stocks of nature, things like air, water, soil, oceans. Biodiversity is a living component, and obviously biodiversity is really important to drive those services and benefits that nature provides. And historically, those benefits and services have been considered to be freely available, infinite, but the way in which we're degrading nature, or nature has been degraded over time, means that these services are increasingly scarce, and this creates risk for businesses. All companies impact and depend upon nature to some extent, particularly when you consider wider than direct operations and look across supply chains and value chains. So the ecosystem services that we're thinking about are generally grouped into four universally understood categories. So that's provisioning, things like provisioning of water, medicine, materials, food and drink. Supporting, so things like nutrient cycles, oxygen production. Regulating, so that's things like climate regulation, clean air, carbon sequestration, flood control. And regulating is quite often related to things like extreme weather, flooding, erosion control. And then finally, things like well-being, health and recreation. Next slide, please. So if we look at this from a sector perspective, I'm not going to go through each of these individually, but that's a good representation of most of the major sectors. And as you can see, each of them depend upon a range of different ecosystem services. The four categories that we talked about on the previous slide are shown there. And you can see that, typically most sectors have a dependency on a range of different ecosystem services. And quite often this is not thought about. Most businesses haven't thought about this over any period of time. And typically, this can quite often be not only in the direct operations, but across supply chains as well. Next slide, please. So I'm going to hand over to Sarah now just to talk a little bit about the way in which these can be considered together.
Thanks, Stuart. Yeah, so building on where Stuart's already begun, but we live amongst interconnected systems, and climate and nature being so closely tied and a fundamental part of planetary health, yet our understanding on nature is really far behind where climate is. And understanding and what might be relevant to you, what these interconnections look like, we can think about how actions that we take to tackle climate issues could have a negative effect on biodiversity or even compound environmental issues if not considered. So, for example, if we think about our dependence on fossil fuels, some might be looking to bioenergy consumption. However, that would then drive significant changes on land use, implicating local biodiversity. On the flip side, also worth noting that there are opportunities which are inherently linked with climate and nature as well. And so an example here would be thinking about climate mitigation and adaptation that supports nature restoration. And when we recognize these interconnections on the environmental impacts, it becomes obvious on the synergies to assess these potential impacts to business together too. So on the next slide, just to highlight some of the key benefits, and what we see as a key driver here is really to develop these approaches in a non-siloed way and that they're not conflicting. And that's true whether you're overlaying nature onto existing climate assessments or if you're starting new to both. Um, so when integrating the approaches, you have the opportunity to develop more well-rounded skill sets on environmental issues. And this means kind of in one fell swoop, you can start to think about business implications and how these issues can be appropriately considered in business processes like risk management and capital allocation for environmental action, for example. Um, I think it's worth acknowledging, whilst this might be kind of one single effort, it's perhaps a bit of a larger effort. But this, in our view, is really allowing you to future-proof those analyses and strategies that might be developed, enabling you to meet multiple requirements as well, where climate and nature, as well as other ESG issues, are coming into one view. And so it's a really effective way in terms of the time, cost, and resource that might be needed, allowing you to have streamlined conversations and decision making on kind of actions which do have implications to each other as well. On the next slide, I'm going to move on to talk about what's kind of driving or behind the recommendations for assessments and disclosure on climate and nature. And what we see is that from the kind of international policy goals have been driven from different places for climate and nature. They're then specified frameworks to provide guidance, which are then wrapped up into regulatory or voluntary reporting frameworks, which bring together a wide range of issues, as I've already mentioned, including both climate and nature. So just working through what you're seeing on this slide, we begin with the Paris Agreement, which sets out the global commitments to limit global warming with best efforts to keep temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. Whilst on the nature side, we had the Global Biodiversity Framework, which was adopted by 196 countries in 2022. And that's promoting a set of targets aimed at halting or reversing nature loss by 2030. Now, moving into the frameworks, you've got the kind of respective task forces on climate and nature related financial disclosures, as well as science-based target setting frameworks, and providing the global standards and recommendations on how to consider the impact on and the environmental issues to business. These are then flowing through to the corporate reporting requirements, which are leveraging these frameworks and which are then being adopted into voluntary and regulatory reporting, like the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And I think across these different standards and frameworks, after we've kind of had the international frameworks like TCFD and TNFD, they each have their slight nuances or differences and purposes, but they are all targeting towards better transparency of information and encouraging positive environmental action through the need to assess risks and impacts and set metrics and targets to manage them. So reflecting back on my comment that nature has been lagging behind climate, on the next slide, we can see the timing around different initiatives and legislations. I think when thinking about the corporate reporting landscape, climate reporting is well developed. You know, the TCFD recommendations were launched in 2017. And so for the past 4 or 5 years or so, we've seen mandated compliance across different jurisdictions, which have really accelerated maturity and have this broader adoption globally, whether that's into listing rules or into governmental acts for mandatory reporting. And now nature reporting is being brought in to the mix, and we expect TNFD will likely follow in the footsteps of TCFD, but perhaps with even more rapid adoption, given the foundations that are already in place and how we're seeing things like that, the EU CSRD legislation move quite rapidly. So the TNFD recommendations were launched in 2023, and yeah, as already mentioned, these are being adopted into frameworks and initiatives to allow that more holistic approach to sustainability. And what we can see is things, as mentioned, the EU CSRD, that includes requirements to assess across 10 different ESG related topics, including climate and nature. Things like CDP this year integrated its climate, forest, and water questionnaire and has incorporated a module on biodiversity as well. And then things like the standards from ISSB, lots of acronyms here, but they're also taking a similar holistic view across ESG. So I think, you know, it's clear how important it is to consider this kind of broad brush and then the kind of connection between nature and climate coming together. And the need for business to assess and reduce biodiversity risk and negative impact is especially front of mind today, with COP16 just kicked off a few days ago. And so hopefully we'll see even further momentum on this topic over the next couple of weeks. On the next slide, and coming back to the analysis recommendations and the holistic approach to climate and nature reporting, I want to look at the kind of foundation that we have in the TCFD and TNFD frameworks. So for those of you that are familiar with the TCFD, you can see that the TNFD follows that same format and structure. Those of you that aren't familiar, there are these 4 main pillars. So you've got governance, which is outlining the roles and responsibility on these different environmental issues. Strategy, which is about how risks, opportunities, and impact may affect the business and how they can be embedded into business planning processes. Risk management, which is thinking about the way risks and impacts are being identified, assessed, monitored, and managed, and how that connects into group-wide processes as well. And then lastly, metrics and targets, kind of in the name, but which enables visibility and accountability on reducing your impact and being able to take on opportunities as well. So really the kind of alignment of these 2 framework sets of recommendations is that it's really easy for that nature-related analyses and disclosures to complement what you may already be in place for climate change. And to get into this in just a touch more detail, on the next slide, we'll just outline some of those similarities, but then also move into the differences, and I'll be passing on to Stuart, who will take you from there. But on the similarity side, so as already mentioned, that you've got this disclosure framework structure, which is the same. And I think really, you know, part of it is to facilitate uptake, but in recognition that it's a tried and tested approach. So companies and are kind of familiar with what's required. In terms of what's needed as well, if we think about the governance, if you already have governance structures in place for climate change, then that can be leveraged for nature. Many of you might have climate change as a standing agenda item or something that is, you know, part of responsibilities, and looking to see where nature can be added onto that. It's kind of a similar in the view for risk management, where you might have gone through conversations after conducting a climate scenario analysis to think about how do we use those results in group-wide risk management processes. Now you can think about how you leverage nature into that as well, or if you're having those conversations for the first time, rather than developing a framework which works for climate, not thinking about nature, you can do it in that kind of one go. And again, you're being streamlined and ensuring you're setting yourself up for success and future needs that might come down the line. And then lastly, and I think importantly, financial impact. Both of these sets of recommendations have financial in their name, and I think it's really important to remember that understanding the way that these different risks and opportunities have a financial implication to businesses is important. With the kind of climate related financial analyses, it's taken quite a while for the market to pick up on an understanding how to conduct those quantifications and how to make meaning out of it. So as nature matures and gets to that same point, there should be a lot of, kind of process and methodologies that have been developed which can be leveraged. But of course, there are aspects in terms of the potential impacts that you have on the environment and nature, and other aspects of analyses which for nature that haven't been considered for climate change. And so that brings us on to the differences, and I'll pass over to Stuart.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So yeah, when we think about the differences between TCFD and TNFD, and this is actually relevant to all of the nature reporting approaches. Obviously, nature is very location specific, and so it's really important to consider where the activity is taking place and the potential sensitivity of that location. There's also a need to consider multiple metrics, again, because nature is very location specific. The value of a particular type of habitat or ecosystem service benefit might have a different value and be measured in a different way at different locations. And that will become more challenging as we get more granular at site level, as we start setting targets for measurement over time. But there's a lot of work being undertaken at the moment to develop that. The TNFD also looks at double materiality, so that's both the way in which your business might impact nature, the inward out, and the way in which you depend upon nature, the outward in, and that obviously then translates into both risks and opportunities. There's also a requirement in TNFD around human rights and the recognition that nature is largely looked after by indigenous populations. They're generally custodians of natural habitats. And then finally, to consider the whole value chain. A frequent conversation we have with clients is that nature and biodiversity isn't material to them based on their direct operations, but obviously there's usually greater impacts, particularly higher up the value chain in things like mining and agriculture. Next slide, please. So just thinking about, I think as we've already said, we're talking specifically in some respects about TCFD and TNFD and the value of kind of integrating the approach for those, but the same goes for all of the nature reporting frameworks and approaches that Sarah outlined earlier. It's generally around those four pillars that the TCFD and TNFD are the architecture of those. So there's a subtly different approach for both corporates and financial institutions. And remember, the key objective of the TNFD is to drive financial flows away from nature harming activities and towards nature supporting activities. So if we think about it from a corporate's perspective, the key consideration is what are your activities and where are those activities located? And then to look at how you interface with nature in those locations. There's a number of different ways of doing that. There's some online tools. Most organizations either haven't started this or are doing this at a very early stage at the moment. We're working with a range of clients globally and getting their kind of early understanding of their kind of key interface with nature. And then finally, sort of what's the scope of the work going to be based on? And the frameworks are really helpful in this respect, because what they do is encourage you to scope what's possible. So rather than think about having to do everything all in the first iteration, you can look at this and develop almost like a pilot project. You can do that over a single geography or a single product line. Obviously, you can't scope out all the things that are harmful and just focus on the things that are easy, but it does enable you to take on what is manageable. And I think, again, one of the key challenges is around information and data, but it's very much a question of starting with what you have access to, what you can use. For financial institutions, it's subtly different. Obviously, that they are far more complex in terms of the number of activities within a number of businesses. The key thing is about thinking about it from a sectoral view at what kind of activities and things like asset classes and different geographies. For financial institutions, it's very much focusing on the sort of downstream. Where is money invested, and what level of risk does that create, and are there opportunities to change that? But using the sort of all of the frameworks as we've talked about are all broadly aligning along the TNFD LEAP approach: locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare. and that's being adopted by the CSRD, is advocating using that kind of approach, as is CDP and GRI. And so the first step is to actually locate where your activities are. Are they in biodiversity sensitive locations? And then to think about what you do in those locations to identify your impacts and dependencies. And from those impacts and dependencies, you can assess your risks and opportunities. So things like a classic that often crops up is availability of water or pollution impact from an activity. And then from there, you can then think about reporting. And obviously there'll be an important step as that process develops to thinking about setting targets, very much like with climate, setting targets probably along science-based targets, and then monitoring that over time and improving your overall output. Next slide, please. So if we think about these together from an integrated approach, so these are the sort of steps that you would take for both TCFD and TNFD. And as we've said a number of times already, you know, the climate reporting is generally largely established. Most organizations have that integrated in their sort of risk and governance process. So the first stage is really important to engage to understand the importance of nature and why that's relevant to organizations. And as I say, very often, one of the biggest challenges around supply chains and where those supply chain activities interface with nature. And then to think about where the gaps are in the information that you have, both for TCFD and TNFD. The next step is to locate your sensitive locations and to identify your impacts and dependencies. And that's obviously relevant for both climate and nature. And then to assess your risks and opportunities and prioritize those based on the severity and the likelihood. We then move on to step 4, scenario analysis. Scenario analysis for climate is quite well developed and understood, much less so for nature, but it's coming. And approaches are being developed. It's going to be important to think about that going forward, particularly. And again, if you think about the interrelationship between climate and nature, nature has the potential to benefit climate. Climate change will impact upon nature. And so you think about some of the initiatives that might be undertaken. It will be important to overlay climate information on top of the nature sort of future analysis or future scenario analysis. So from there, it's a question of evaluating the resilience, scoring risks and opportunities, and then think about that in a financial context. And then to integrate into your business decision making. So both nature and climate. Again, if you're thinking about risk and governance, if you're thinking about policy, if you're thinking about board oversight, a lot of that can be done in the same way, in the same steps. We're even starting to see integrated TCFD and TNFD reporting. Then the question of setting targets, including targets for nature, and then iterating that. So that'll be about collecting data, monitoring improvement, and then iterating and to keep reporting. And I think, as Sarah's already mentioned, at the moment, the TNFD is a voluntary framework. CSRD biodiversity module ESRS4 is a legal requirement, but it's likely, particularly post COP16, that we'll probably see more of the 196 governments adopting TNFD as a mandatory requirement, and ultimately I think we will see TNFD align with TCFD and the ISSB, and we're even seeing a TISFD for social impact as well being developed next year, and so ultimately we might see a full integration of all of those together. Next slide, please. And so just to sort of sum up really, think about how do you actually get started with this. So I think very often the starting point is, for most organizations, they're quite well developed around climate. They've not really started on that nature journey, or they're not really sure where to start. And it's very much a question of starting as simple as you can, start with what you know. So identify which activities are in sensitive locations and what your basic impacts and dependencies are. And that can set a high level priority. It doesn't have to be across all of your value chain. You could start with your direct operations in one region. You can link nature and climate related risks and use physical climate risk analysis for nature. You've already probably done supply chain mapping for scope 3 emissions, and so understanding supply chains. And again, we recognize that supply chains are very complex, and so there's going to be a challenge, but thinking about which suppliers are most material to you, which are the most significant by spend, for example, which suppliers' activities are the most, there's quite a lot of good information around which sectors have the most impact on nature. And then sort of just take it step by step, really. The LEAP process is a systematic approach. It's quite broken down into quite simple steps. We've developed a fairly simple approach for organisations, which we're working with many clients, which helps you get started in sort of identifying that sort of early position. I think one of the things we'd encourage as well is not to think necessarily just about reporting, but actually understanding this internally for yourself. So even if you don't intend to report on it, getting started early and understanding what your interface with nature is and how you might be able to link that with your climate reporting, your overall sustainability reporting, is a good early step. Even if you don't report against CSRD or TNFD until 2026 or beyond, it's a good step to understand and to start thinking about where the gaps are and where you might need to collect more data. And then, like climate reporting, this will improve over time. So there'll be a real opportunity to better integrate all of your reporting requirements. It's better to start early, even if it's not perfect. We often talk about, don't let perfection be the enemy of getting started. That there will inevitably be some gaps. And I think that's everything, actually. Next slide. Yeah, that's everything. So I think we'll hope that's been useful. We'll open up to questions if anybody's got them. Pass back to you, Rachel.
Thanks both. Yeah, so we've got some questions that have come through the chat box. So firstly, for companies with complex value chains, where should they start when thinking about how they depend and impact upon nature?
So I think that's a good question, actually. I think probably the best place to start is to sort of, obviously there will be quite often supply chains particularly are very complex. There might be thousands of suppliers. But I think, as I just mentioned a moment ago, starting by maybe breaking down your supply chain into sort of your top 10 by value, for example, because that's where you have the potential to influence the greatest. You might be able to start working with some of those suppliers because they're important to you in a way that you might not with a supplier that's only, say, 0.1% of your overall supply chain. So I think starting with something rather than thinking about trying to do all of it is probably the best approach to that.
Great, thank you. So another question here is, in what ways do you think climate reporting will help to accelerate the adoption of nature reporting by corporates?
I pick up on this one first, Stuart, and then you can chip in.
Sure.
But yeah, I think with climate reporting, it's already kind of accelerated a shift in corporate practices, creating these like frameworks and tools, and also external expectations that can now be extended to nature. And so with these increased investor and regulatory pressures as well, I think nature will move much more quickly than when we first saw the TCFD recommendations launched and they were adopted voluntary. And as Stuart's already mentioned, that's evident through the requirements in CSRD as well, which is requiring companies to look at their nature risks and impacts as well opportunities. I think potentially around kind of the tools and data that ideally we'd want, and that might be limited now, as these pressures cascade through value chains. You're not the only ones that would be seeking to do this sort of assessment. That will facilitate the accelerated development of nature reporting. And yeah, we already have the basis from climate to leverage on nature on top.
I think just to add to that, I completely agree, Sarah. I think that the fact that the architecture is all very similar and there's almost a direct overlay, as well as the fact that, as you say, because organisations are being asked for information, even if you're not reporting, the fact that you're being asked for information so if somebody down your sort of value chain is asking you about what you do around nature, just having some understanding to be able to pass that information on, to be able to continue to be a good supplier in that respect, is another reason why I think it'll accelerate more quickly.
Great. So then the next question, how should companies navigate a lack of data if they don't have complete information on the location of their operations?
So I think sort of typically most organisations know the locations of their direct operations. Obviously, they've got either grid coordinates or addresses, and you can put those into some of the freely available tools and get some good information out of that. I think where you look at supply chains, that's typically where location data is perhaps not available, or you might have a head office, for example, and not necessarily have all the specific locations of every operation that's sort of providing into that supply. I think there you can use sort of an activity-based approach. So tools like the Encore tool are very good at actually providing information about sort of which sectors or which subsectors provide what levels of impact and what their dependencies are. And so you can start with that, and then obviously from there you can start asking questions of those suppliers to start understanding better. You know, we did some work in the coffee sector, and obviously one of the key challenges with that is that quite often the coffee buyers or the coffee companies don't have direct access to the growers. They're generally through traders. But I think over time there will be a recognition that information will be required, and so there will be more transparency, and those that facilitate that kind of information will succeed, and those that don't will find it more difficult in the marketplace. And so I think, as Sarah said, we'll see probably quite rapid change over time as everybody sort of gets with this. We're already starting to see that. But I think the key message is start with what you've got. You know, I've seen some TNFD reports already that are very, very simple. And there's a real acknowledgement that they're by no means complete, but they're starting. And I think as we saw with TCFD, over time, you'll just see that get better as more people understand what they have to do and more suppliers have information ready to pass down their value chain.
So kind of along a similar vein, we have a question here. Is it relatively easy to assess the dependencies on nature? It is relatively easy to assess the dependencies on nature, but how can you measure impact when your suppliers may not have processes in place to assess this or provide data? Would you need to set a nature baseline in the same way you do for carbon emissions?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. I think the impact upon nature, I mean, there are a number of different approaches being developed at the moment around setting, you know, sort of understand, because we're going to have to start setting targets. To have a target, you need to have a baseline. You need to be able to measure and quantify what you've got at the moment. So think about the state of nature in any location. And that's where I talked earlier about having different metrics that will be required for different locations. So I think, yes, essentially you'll need to establish some kind of starting position at a point in time to be able to measure and set targets against that. And I think that, you know, the kind of some of the impacts will be quantitative. Some of them will have to remain as a qualitative basis because there'll be multiple forces acting upon that that part of nature, and so it might not necessarily be as straightforward to identify, you know, where something like pollution is quite easy to be able to calculate or to measure. You know, the kind of impact of water availability would be much less easy to measure because there'll be multiple things. You know, climate will be impacting the state of nature in that location, water availability, etc., etc.
Yeah, I think just on that note, kind of acknowledging the uncertainties, but using kind of the best available data and then combining qualitative and quantitative assessments is the best way to kind of start the journey, and then ensure that's communicated in your disclosures as well of where those limitations have been or assumptions that have been made.
And that's a really good point, actually, Sarah. I think, again, you know, thinking about the TNFD, I think it's clear about it does give that flexibility in terms of what you report, so long as you explain why you've scoped something in a particular way or why you haven't been able to use a certain type of data. But over time, we expect that, you know, you'll collect more data, others will collect more data, and the knowledge around how to measure will develop as well. And so you'll just see a general improvement over time quite quickly, I think, in the ability to measure those things.
So we have another question that's come in about whether either of you know if there's any TNF guidance yet available for financial institutions or pension funds.
The specific guidance in the TNFD for the financial sector. So if you go onto the TNFD website and look under the additional, there's like a resource library. There's a specific guidance document for financial institutions, and it's really useful. But I'm happy to help out if anybody wants to get in touch afterwards. I can either point you in the direction or run through that. We're doing some work with a financial institution at the moment in terms of TNFD, so that's quite familiar.
Okay, great. And then how can we convince stakeholders or investors of the materiality of nature-related risks when their financial impacts are less obvious compared to, say, climate reporting?
That's a really difficult one. I think if you think about the starting point is generally absolutely zero knowledge. I think when most of the engagement we've had is when you start talking to an organisation, the starting point is often nature and biodiversity isn't material to us. We've got 20 factories across Europe on industrial estates. It's not material to us. But then when you start explaining about the supply chain and the kind of the ways in which we rely upon nature for certain things, and you give sort of specific examples of, I don't know, water dependency, for example, or the impact, the reputational impact of fines through pollution, and then start looking at what the financial risk might look like. I think that's when you start to see, organisations or particularly senior leadership understand what this means. It's going to take time because you can see that that there is, and this is in part the argument for thinking about these more holistically, because that there is an increasing ESG burden for most organisations. I think that's quite well recognised with many companies reporting against a number of different ESG standards. But actually, in trying to pull all these together and consider the interrelated nature of all of the sustainability topics enables you to think more holistically and to kind of streamline. As Sarah said, there's cost efficiencies, there's time efficiencies, and so the key part of this is just education and using good materials, getting good support to help educate.
Great, thank you. So the final question we have here is, do you think companies should wait until they have assessed their nature footprint before trying to introduce more nature positive actions into their operations, or can this be done in tandem?
It can be done in tandem, definitely. I think most organisations have probably got some kind of nature initiative somewhere in their direct operations. What we see quite often is you've got a high level strategy at one level, and you've got a number of disparate projects at site or operational level, and there's not a lot of joining up between the two. I mean, obviously, ideally, understanding how you interface with nature first, and then developing those initiatives to reflect those impacts and dependencies makes a lot of sense. But certainly you can bring those two together. I think probably an important part of that is actually to try and bring it all together as part of a strategy. So if you get the strategy right and the approach right, the reporting should all fall out of that as a direct consequence without actually having to aim at the reporting. That's the way I would approach it, I think.
Great. Well, thank you both. And just to let everybody know that the recording will be shared via email and there will be contact information available with that. So if you have any further questions for Sarah or Stuart or you'd like to get in touch, please do. So thank you everyone for joining, and we hope you have a lovely rest of the day. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye bye.